다 가상 이제 개와다 디바세데 돕치죠. 아니 어데 디고마 슈바레 지나다 돕치죠. 야야 될이야. 아니 시권에 아니 그 저게 돕치시요레스 띵이권에 돕치시요레스 능무벽권에 돕치시요레스 안데지 어두시는 가서 가서 디나니다 신규권에 돕치시요데 개와사야단 디버사이게 유 안신게를 때네 사야들에 아니 돕겐 디바치시요 되네 요레스 시에다 돈다니 보다가도 다 라마다 아니 지게 라마단 드라이브게 연대대 덴바다 되네 랑게 파마로서 봐도 군조 숨다 전시sem바 안데솔라 메지 최보부가 있나 다 아주게 직개와디 슈 첨부시 사고레스 디바로 시위네 디바체 용고레스 어두시네 주데 아바도 전시sem바리아 덴비게다 직나주게 세는 개와 춘주지 주베이네야 아니 개와 빼면서 또 침바사고레스 대인자당 가서 되니시네네 야 디바사반 디바침사고 가서 될이야는 도시네 하고 외터네 어주기다 기회 잼냐와 냠르주에 되게 침보레서 가서 디슈로다.
Good morning. Then last night we continued to look at the presentation on differentiating between heavy and light karma, and we came to the second presentation of what makes a karmic action particularly powerful, and this is presented by way of 4 points. And of these 4 points are, firstly, that of the field, which is the recipient of the activity, so to whom towards the virtuous or non-virtuous act is directed. And then what we'll still come to is that of the support. So that's the basis of the vows of the person engaging in the activity. The third will be the thing or the substance that is offered. And the fourth is the attitude or motivation. So we looked at the first of those 4 last night, the field or recipient. And there it was presented as being the 3 jewels, lamas, those similar to lamas, so teachers of other people, bodhisattvas, and one's parents. And what was presented is that even a ordinary act towards them, towards such a field, such a recipient, will produce great consequences, great karmic results. So and this is in the context of both virtuous and non-virtuous activities. So this presentation is important to know, because in dependence on these 4 characteristics, of which the first is the field, one's regular karmic activities can produce a greatly enhanced result. So we'll start now at the bottom of page 132, which is the second of these 4 aspects, great strength by way of the support. And support here refers to the person who is engaging in the virtuous activity or the non-virtuous activity.
초와 신도 미케바당 미케바당 케베지비 디바양 엔지와다 양월 송소스.
So reading from the text, and I've just added a few words of no real significance. Just as even a tiny lump of iron sinks to the bottom, whereas a container made from it floats on top, so likewise the bad actions committed by unskillful people and skillful people are respectively heavy and light.
양 자기 첨부를 신나 레벨을 쇠 뇌로지 레벨을 쇠 샤베나 주간을 샤시나 마마딘 바치 주간이야 되고 그래서 지상 권익이다 권익 띵 뇌 뭐보 그런이 개발기 전에 직디 도도디마 디미야다 직디에나 레벨을 쇠 뇌도 제시 버디 바야 주간이야 되리 버디 띵이 뭐보 개발 샤되어 봐 원디나신 베디나신 아 저기 다 미케바 세대 안에 저게 마신바 내수직 샤라기 기회 냠내 체다 디봉 교류게 냠내 체다 마신행기 디바 개와 체바다 안 개와디 충화 체고레스 안에 미케바지기 다 니네게 냠내 제당 신게시 케바디기 제바이네 안에 개와 체바네 개와 체와레스 대디 띵 냠내 시간 고선 식으로 지사다 데네기 디바 사바네 미케바 디바 사바네 디바디 체와라 차야다 아니 미케바 냠랭이 제단이 한 신gen디기 토네 제바이나 딱 디바 사반 디바디는 충화 체거레스 케바다 미케바시데 다니 마싱바르시 근데 케베스데 데네기 게베 냠랭 제다 신gen이게세 데 케베 제베 디바양 지와다 양월 송소 제사다 미케베지베 디바디나 지와레 미케베지베 디바디나 디바 양화 차고레스 다 미케베지베게 개와치는 개와 총화레스 케베지베 디바체는 개와체는 개와 체와 차고레스 원송을 디바들원
The illustration given is, if we imagine just a small lump of metal, it will just sink to the bottom of water. It doesn't need to be particularly large, but it will immediately sink to the bottom of a pool of water. But if that same lump of metal is fashioned into a different shape, perhaps curved and hollow, it will float on the surface of the water. It will not sink. So the meaning then is those who have fashioned their mind in a way so that they are skilled or knowledgeable, they can make great virtue, accumulate great virtue with ease, and non-virtue that they still accumulate is likely to be minor. But those who have not fashioned their mind in a particular way, and therefore are unskillful in their activities, lacking knowledge, they will struggle to accumulate great virtuous deeds and are much more likely to accumulate powerful non-virtue.
중국의 개인연맹 제발라 다 신바 개발을다 되네 제니기 마신와다 되네실에 케미게세 디스오레 개인연맹 제발라 케미게스.
So the words translated as unskillful or skillful can also be translated as knowledgeable or lacking knowledge, or scholar or non-scholar. And so these are terms that can be applied in a limitless number of contexts. But here it refers specifically to the context of knowing the Dharma and thereby being able to accumulate virtue, or not knowing the Dharma and thereby accumulating immense non-virtue.
아니 대양서 다디니 디버진 최종 예비 김전서 대양 다 캐비기 디버 체바이나 디버 총아레스 대인비 김전델 디송거레 대양 아마라 겨라 치마 domshi 디버 미상바르 디년보 개와 제비게 개바라 양으로 송기스 제자다 개바라 양와 이미 김생가서네 개바 디기 개위 개조 냠는 지게 신경 디기 디버 사베네 람사 아니 디발이야 인가마 제바딜레 교화게야다 아니 치마다 마음바다 지금에서 dom심게 다가지 디버 샤야스로 되네 dom심게제 아니 디버 미상와서야디 소수게 녀바 치마라 디버디 파베 마베바체 파는 니 디버딘데 중소시비 권좌리아 데닉슈네 샤돔지야 중고로와 데닉이 메상와제 아니 님보띠 님보 개와제바서 디닉이 디버샤야게 된다라 아니 소수게 개와 가르 주바이네 주요도 지자다 디바디 계신 nyama diva cheba ina diva de chunga chao karasne ko ma sha do ko re se ora da ko je karasne nyembo deni ge tin je nga mala jeba de gyesim ge chimala je me se domsim ge deni diva me sawa ya na sangye da ju sembal yang de deni diva che so de no re chun so se be dia shu che an diva sha ye de na ge we cha wa du yo de jeba in za deni che shin ge ba za ji ge ba za je za diva de yang wa re se yang wa song gi se diva de lo re.
Now, Lama Tsongkhapa presents a reasoning to explain or to back up what has just been presented. It is said that for those who are skillful, who regret their previous bad actions, restrain themselves in the future, do not keep them secret, and apply their virtuous antidotes, they are light. So here a reason is presented as to why, with the analogy, a lump of metal, if it's fashioned in a particular way, it will float to the top. So this is where we see that those who are skillful or knowledgeable in the Dharma, but also skillful in terms of their mind, on those occasions when they do accumulate non-virtue, they will recognize this as non-virtue. One, they'll be aware enough of their own mind and behavior, and they will also have the understanding of what is virtuous and non-virtuous, and immediately regret will come. They won't not observe their non-virtue. They also won't excuse their non-virtue. Immediately, regret will come. And not only will regret come, but they will then commit to not doing so again, because they know that this is harmful to themselves, and through them, harmful to others. And therefore, they will not conceal it, but will rather confess it, or as it's here, not keep it secret, but will confess their non-virtue, and will accumulate virtue to purify. So in this way, the skillful practitioner will accrue far less non-virtue, and when they do, it will be light in strength, because they will immediately purify it.
nyama cheba de gyesim ge da de ne ge da chima ma bo chi me se be de ne sam ma na wa che ane sam ta ma shin ba de ne an nyama di ba di sai di ba di pha an ji ge sha ye don da la ke jo khan ya ma du ba che an di ba chi ge de da ga ra che du se ne sha ba ne da di ba di che wa res di ba ji wo che cha go wa da ka se ne 직제 양산이 지금 루션 nemba jawedu da chercher rukorwa keba dige pa dirin chi chumba ne shobe dibar sa ko da dine shaktum je yan dine ma dusen je du ko chercher dra yo mara je di da mikeba si de dine ge da dibar chi wa je dine ge da dibati an chi ki che yan nyembo tenche ma sha ma shin ba da gara da je ba da gara sha sha dus je ne ya 직제 ni je dusine
Whereas those who are unskillful, they will act in completely the opposite way. When they engage in non-virtue, they most probably will not even be aware of it. Or if they do, they're not likely to generate regret, much more likely to excuse their behavior, justify their behavior. And therefore, the wish to refrain from such non-virtuous behavior, not very likely to arise. And therefore, the wish to purify that non-virtue is not going to arise. So what we see here is that someone who's unskillful will accumulate so much more non-virtue because they won't even be aware of it, or if they are, they won't recognize it as being non-virtuous, and therefore will have no wish to purify or restrain themselves. So therefore, those who are unskillful will with ease accumulate extensive non-virtue. Lama Tsongkhapa concludes with, whereas for those who arrogantly assume they are skillful and do not do this, but out of contempt deliberately engage in them, they are heavy.
디바 제바들 교심게 다 치마 지금에서 dom심게 제디 님보 게와 마제바이나 세월다 미제바 계수 요건에 시신도 주바 캐벌론바 다 소소게 아당아 신규에 가 직되네시네 안디소이 디바로 제나 디스 가야마 디부 충주를 세베게 되네 또 계수제 샤제 안데노 아가 신규에 되게 하고 그에서 베게 되네 소소게 되네게 캐벌론바 세고 소소 신매나 신규 베게 지금 나야를 롬제네 되네게 제바이나 아니 디바디 지와 차고라 그래서 나 디바를 교심지고 아마 교심지하다 디기에는 치마 지금에서 좀 세마게 된 님보에 띵고 말지다 되는 어디가 뒤도 충분히 가지고 말했은 디기 여행 가지고 말했을 때 되네게 소소 신기도 도지 롬바지 두신 샤바이나 되네 안에 디디바디 지와 차기리 SSD 송도 하는
Whereas for those, so this refers to those who are engaging in non-virtue, who arrogantly assume they are skillful. So these are people, so this word translated as skillful, it's a good translation. It can also be translated as knowledgeable. So take both the meanings throughout this paragraph. So those who consider themselves knowledgeable in the Dharma, skillful in the Dharma, when they engage in non-virtue, because of an inflated sense of pride, thinking, I'm learned, I've done all this practice, they then look at the non-virtue they've engaged and dismiss it, saying, it doesn't matter, it's insignificant. So in this way, out of contempt, they ignore the non-virtue that they accumulate, and therefore they accumulate significant non-virtue.
가르고고라 가는 줄이야 냠술이야 가르쳐 왔으니까 제가 내가 저기 다 디바로 직 되니게 다 저게 중화이나 하고 디바 사바이나 소소하고나 남사 안 저기 베네쇼게 디바이나 가상 킹이 디바 그디 디바로 사바이나 하고 바이나 대해서는 남사 오다디 되네지와 디바 노트 준샤 안지민도 왔으니까 교심계다 근데 마오바나다 치만에 되네게 자와긴 지금에 SMP dom심계야 되네게 돈에 나의 소식이 야 안에 건조스나 상계단 정시sember 둔데 USMB게 뭐바체제 소식이다 등이 되네기 디바체 노트 준샤되네 등민도 sember게 되네 디드는 양의 디바데 샤긴 sember게 삼다장 조도신 게제 주고고리에서 올다 된다데 되네 주베나 다 소식이 디바로 충분해 디바데 안에 충분히 차로 그래 이 진짜산 디기 디바 전부 책 말했어 거기네 사샤야 되네 다 디린지제는 망고반에 디바 유나시브 제시로 와지 제베네 디바 체르 차고 말해서 어두신에 나도 또 제호래서 단단히보다 디고 거래 되슈라야
The meaning here is that we need to develop an awareness of our own behavior, in particular the direction our mind is in, so that we can recognize when we do engage in non-virtue. And then with the recognition of non-virtue having been accumulated, independence on the teachings one has received, immediately then, recognizing as non-virtue, generate regret, recognizing this was non-virtuous, it caused harm to myself and possibly to others. And from this regret, a mind of restraint, I will not do this again. Then one confesses to the basis that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, apologizes to them with sincerity, imagining oneself in their presence, and then intentionally accumulates virtue so as to purify that non-virtue. So in this way, one applies the opponent powers readily without needing to have it done as a formal session, but watches one's mind and responds appropriately. And in this way, the non-virtue that, as ordinary beings, we will accumulate is weakened significantly. And not only is the non-virtue that we accumulate weakened, but by sincerely engaging the four opponent powers in this way, we create a block within ourselves, an obstruction within ourselves to engaging in new non-virtue. So in this way, we both purify past non-virtue, and we serve to limit the accumulation of new non-virtue. So this is what we should take from this presentation.
That dine KBG Kewadian Kewa Cheware, that BKBG Kewadian Kewa Chumare said. Just not that Yamlin Jing and Jigi Bina Chimbash chicken, Simja, Jilia, Tangazu, Kalaro, Chimba Tawade, Taniga get Keva, the Magava, Niga Chimba Tawa, Kiwa Sava Chiba Imbana, that Keva Digi, and a Kunol Masona Kunong me, and Chik Pembe, Sempe Kunia, Lajipat, Chikuno, Yachishon, some Dachi Kunia Chimbataya. In Jimbati, that's a Chelia, other Dinege, in Chimbata, Kewa, Bear, which also Sempe, Delia, Kawa, Kumbia, Chisuyan Cheada. Dinege Wadi, Ajiang, Simja Tamji, or do sing over in that Gawadi, and Jimbata, Gawadi, Dopche, Sagora, Dele, Carson, Keva, Korongi, Dinege, Unwada, Dinege Delia, Chisuyan Cheada, Diso Gawarwa, Chisuyan, Dinamo, do Chidu, and make Gawadi Shuk Church Arugorwa. That the negi Mikabaina Suzuki the magic Chimbaitaje, Rich Keva Chevin, Dushin, Jendel, Jesu Irata, and Moada, and the negi Kuno Jachimba, some Damashawene, Jimbata, the Kewachi Sagortina, the Kevati, Kewachimbatan, Jechevina, Kevati, the Kevi, Jadi, Kevati, Shucher Chasonwa, Dusine.
What I hope I've managed to emphasize throughout the presentation thus far is that this presentation refers to both virtuous and non-virtuous behavior. So it's a way that to avoid accruing great non-virtue, but also a way to accrue great virtue. So those who are skillful and unskillful can engage in the same activity, but can accrue a very different result in terms of the magnitude of virtue accumulated. To give an example, someone who's not skillful or knowledgeable in the Dharma, when they engage in a virtuous act, let's say they're giving food to animals, they will just do so and be done, and they'll go on about their day. Nothing much going on within side of themselves, and therefore, whilst virtue is accumulated, it will be minor. But someone who is skillful in the Dharma, doing that same act, they will generate a motivation beforehand. In particular, they will try to generate as best they can a motivation of bodhicitta, of wanting, by helping this being in this minor way, to be able to help all beings in the most important of ways. And with a motivation of bodhicitta, they will then engage in the act, and they'll do so with a mind of delight, of enjoying helping others, helping to alleviate the suffering of others. And even so, whilst they're engaging in it, will be a mind similar to rejoicing. And they will have rejoiced in it when they have made the generous deed. So this will serve to amplify the virtue being accumulated. And thereafter, the third part is they will dedicate the virtue. So a person who's skillful will, unlike a person who's unskillful, will generate a motivation, a specific motivation before engaging in the act. They'll engage in the act with a mind of delight and rejoice in the act, and they will dedicate those three components.
Simja Tamji Dunda, Samda Sanjoko to be Shirdo, and they Kunwa Dineke Kunwachke, Dine Gawadi troop, then Gawa to Sevichelia, and the Gawadia, Simja Tamji Dunda, Sanjoko to be Shirdo, Moa Jia, the Duschevena, that Gawadi, and Jik Topchembora Charugorwa, and J. Chisuinea, and Gawadi Cheva de la Rangi. And only in the Java in the Bay of Chunsha, Simbe, Yana, Yado, Gawa Kumbaina, Dine and Gavati Topchimbacha, or Jazan to the dining body on the Dusin, Yaman Gawa Karchep and Kulung, and the Janju Simbu Kunia Layada, and Dine and the Gawa troop, Dine Gawa troop Savichelia, Moa Jayada, Simja Tamju, Sanyoko to which you Moyata, and there among Bane Suzuki, Gavat Chevatilage, Jesu Irayana and the Dusin. Some Dangore said that on dining body to do shin and to see a holy songore.
So, what I want you to take from this then is that be aware of your mind, And when you are about to engage in an activity, ensure you're doing so with a virtuous motivation. And the motivation should be ideally one of bodhicitta. That one is, I'm about to engage in this activity, whatever it may be. Let's say it's this act of generosity, whatever it may be. By doing so, may I alleviate the suffering of others. And may I alleviate not only directly the suffering of this being, but may I alleviate the suffering of all beings. And not just their temporary suffering, but may I alleviate the suffering of them being born in samsara. May I lead them all to gain freedom from suffering. And to do this, through this generous act, may I quickly become a Buddha for the sake of others. And then one engages in the generous act, or the virtuous act. And one does so now with this motivation of bodhicitta. And rejoice, to have a mind of delight whilst doing so, which will come naturally with such a motivation. And then afterwards, dedicate the virtue. Dedicate it to the accomplishment of that motivation. And then continue to rejoice. Take delight in what you've done. Because this rejoicing serves to both amplify the merit accumulated and make it so much more likely that you'll look out for such opportunities to be of benefit again.
Tenza datin ma dona makar sungur tinyu kone da chechun yanda de dona ya remochi pumbu ndole sa tene tonsum ye simjen tamje teshin la shude kolo gyugi gesi dan dembe de rere kyang marme ne geso zamla ningbo rep zamgis marme sangi yi chöden la chöba we 장심 김내 중화 네 말메 닝보 주마르기 꾸이바 최딘이 중도 진바 쇠남기 예차야 미퍼버 송데스.
That concludes the first part of this great strength by way of the support, where we looked at the difference between the skillful and the unskillful. Now we come to the second sub-outline, which is presenting quotations from Sutra to establish the strength of the support. So reading from the text. The Heap of Jewels Sutra also declares that if all the sentient beings of the billion universes were to have entered the Mahayana and gained the endowments of universal monarchs, and if each of them were to offer butter lamps in vessels the size of an ocean, and with sticks and with wicks the size of Mount Meru to a stupa of a Buddha, this would not match even 1/100th part of the merit of a bodhisattva who has left his home and who holds up a little bit of wick smeared with butter in front of a stupa.
나도나를 가르송여서는 동숨예 심전 탐제 태신을 슈디에서 왔다. 다 동숨예 심전 탐제에서 당한 주게 동지다 동이 동숨세야 되니까 다 심전报道 매바 지혜셔와 되니까 심전 탐제 태신을 슈디에서 태바친 비게 장주 셈규래 예제 태바친 별람 규래 예네 다디네 김비 장주 셈 봐서 그래. 김바 되니까 김비 장주 셈 봐. 되니까报道 매바 동숨이 디로제네 태진 전주 셈게 태진 람규레게 되네 안에 디수기 쳐봐 콜로기 게시데 템바 다 그런들로 롱셔를 마서나 콜로스미 게시데 템바 여바나 신제 디수기다 미레레 강안 마르메게 뇌디 베 지가침보 야수나신 첨보제 될이야 다 최동 마서나 럽나신 첨보 주제 마르메 데 안에 상기에 최딘을 표현하 다 수는 바도메 바사기로다 지사 데니게 전주심바 레레게 김바 전주심 레레기 데니게 동숨게 전주심바 태바지면서 전주심바 되게다 동숨라도 장가 망고 쉬우셔봐 대수 레레게다 데니게 최메 표현도 최메 개치선 마서나 개소나신 첨보체 데네 최동 주야데 배 리접나지 첨보 될 주데 마음에 표현에다 마음에 배 첨보지다 왜 첨보 쇼지여도 와다 데니게 최된을 표현에 다서는 바도메 바사고로와 제단데 서는 최된이 최배 사디스 디바도 상이 최된라 최배 사디 최바세 어디
So again, the Buddha presented comparisons. So we'll look at the first half of the comparison. So the sutra declares that if all the sentient beings of the billion universes, so what's been translated as billion universes, you'll have come across elsewhere and more literally as the 3,000 world systems, but the meaning is exactly this. So it's to show just how many sentient beings. So if all of them were to have entered the Mahayana, so in other words, they have generated bodhicitta within their mind. So they are bodhisattvas. They've generated uncontrived bodhicitta. But you'll see from the comparison, they are not ordained. And it continues, and have gained the endowments of universal monarchs. So this refers to have attained inconceivable wealth and power, incredible material resources as well as power and influence. And with such power, influence, and material resources, if each of them were to offer butter lamps in vessels the size of an ocean, and with wicks the size of Mount Meru to a stupa of a Buddha, so this illustration of an offering is inconceivable for people like ourselves, but this is possible for beings with such inconceivable material wealth and resources.
장심 김내 중외에서 장심 김내 중외에서 장주sem바 랍중세오다 랍중 김내 중화 김내 김에 바랍도 중화 도마다 된게 장주sem바 어디기다 김내 중외에서 말미 니보 주마르기 구바서 단 말미게 최무 피해디 만주 주말 가서 더 주의 쇠시 말이어와 다 되네게 최무직 피바이나 그确定了确定 정도 진바 确定 정도 부바이나다 선남 예차야 미법을 송대 제사 대시 전주선배 김바 동송게 전주선배 대주기 마음에 깨쳐모쇼 제제나 부여비 선남 대래 다들 랍중게 전주선배 디기 마음에 주인이보 최매직 부여디 디기 계제 개탐버전에 계제 찍랑 세리 아니 동숨 예전심바 김비 부여디 선남 디젤마도 연구 말해. 제사다 계좌 구주 고고기 김바 가서 전주심 랍중지기 취임 부여디다 선남 배워 쳐야래 저거다.
The comparison continues. This would not even match. So this would not even match. So here we bear in mind what an incredibly virtuous activity has just been undertaken. This incredible number of beings, not just beings, bodhisattvas, making the most inconceivable of offerings. No one would doubt that each of them has created an incredible amount of merit, let alone them all combined. So now the comparison comes. This would not even match 100th part of the merit of a bodhisattva who has left his home. So this then, the comparison here is, this practitioner, now in the second part, is also a bodhisattva, like those others, but they have ordained. So having gone forth into the homeless life, having ordained. And who holds up a little bit of a wick smeared with butter in front of a stupa. So we see how vastly different the offering is that this ordained bodhisattva makes, but the merit accumulated is many multiples greater. The non-ordained bodhisattvas only accumulate a small fraction of the merit compared to the ordained bodhisattva.
김바다 제주선배가 랍중이 개와체반에 띵 랍중이 전에다 개와디 안에 제사고레스 디네자 델리아 소야디 디니사 삼바당 신라 캐브라 매징 모보라 캐브라 신도 체양 띵기 돕수 안에 살로오서.
So what the difference in this comparison is that in the second part, the ordained bodhisattva has the support of vows on their continuum, vows of ordination on their continuum. And that makes the power of the act, that support, because this is the meaning of great strength by way of the support of vows, makes that act so much more powerful. Then the text continues. This makes clear the strength of the support, even if there is no difference in the attitude and the field, and even if the thing offered is very different. So this makes clear the strength of the support, even if there, so support here refers to vows, and even if there's no difference in the attitude. So because in the comparison, both groups were bodhisattvas, so that bodhicitta on their continuum. And the field, as we saw in the previous point, that is the recipient. And yeah, it's the same. So there's no difference there in terms of either attitude or field.
동몽부 유와 차거로와 빠트메바 유와 차거로와 장거집에나 몽부 체중제는 야침부 차거로와 나 전주선바 랍중기 전주선바 푸에디 강지로와 야야 충주지 마도요 말아 제산 푸에 경호보들라 배 캐바 체중시부로래세 캐바라 모보라 캐바라 신도 체스
And even if the thing offered is very different. So the thing offered, what is being offered? Here in this illustration, in this comparison, we see there is a great difference. What is being offered by the bodhisattvas, who do not have vows of ordination, is immense. For us, it really is quite inconceivable to offer butter lamps in the vessels of the size of an ocean and with wicks the size of Mount Meru. This is an inconceivable offering, especially when compared to what the ordained bodhisattva offered, which is a wick smeared with butter in front of a stupa. So a very ordinary offering compared to one quite extraordinary.
안디네 자다 두스천상한테 삼다는 군론란 개발매 푸세 유 신린의 개발매래 당고보 직딜에 빼 맛이 망보다 첨보 야첨보 휴시래 직디 충충래제 지사동원에 삼다는 네 개체와다 아니 가지 체와 부회나 아니 손님 체사서 차고로 봐 이나다디 디네 마사와제 디 도쇼 샤소로 봐 데네기 디 도쇼 차와다 가르스네 대양사 데네기 첨보 차야 되는 진주sem바 랍중의디기 첨보 차야다 디 가르쳐버리신 개와 체에 차고 김전 가르스는 대한 띵이 돕수 살레스 그 띵이 돕기레스 세부레스 그 개와 체와 차와디 띵이 돕기 개와 첨보 체와 차와 임바데 세부 쉬우레스 가르스는 유부에게 응업에 천제반에는 그 충충마도요 말아와 체 차요 말 꿀롱아 천에는 직발에 부에게 부세게 유 아니 띵에는 직발에 제사다 개와 체와 차고야도 김전 가르려는 그 띵이 돕기 임바데 세부 쉬우레스 올다 띵이 돕수 살로 호사래
We see here the motivation or attitude, there is no difference. The recipient, there is, or field, there is no difference. The object offered, vastly different. And then the text concludes, this makes clear the strength of the support. So in other words, where the difference really comes that leads to the great merit being accumulated is the support. In other words, the vows on the continuum of the person making the offering.
제사다 띵기 나 전시sem바 김바디 가르스네 전시sem바 김바다 전시sem바 랍준 이가기 전시심유 군에 라데 심제 탐지기 된제다 심제 탐지 산교고 토벌 제비게 다 지바르와 자와 지바데 이나다 김 랍주 디기 나 룽아 예수님 돈에 샬리아 네버체 차상 Doma Sungu Jigmese, Doma Sungorwada. Jigdida Doma Masonga is that Doma Sungu Chane, and the Koran Gawache Yunkore said to Jumzendirwad, Rapjuan said the Doma Sunga is the Doma Sungu Chane, all those Gawache, the DDS one.
So both groups here, of the ordained and non-ordained bodhisattvas, they have the same motivation of wanting to alleviate all beings of suffering, take all beings to full and complete enlightenment, and therefore are striving to become Buddhas themselves. So there's no difference in terms of their motivation or to whom the offering is made. But the difference comes is that the ordained bodhisattva has taken the vows that serve to restrain their physical, verbal, and mental behavior from bringing any harm. And it's that addition of the support that leads to so much more merit from the same acts being accumulated.
That is Gumsendigi sometimes the Rigbe said that the Kong the Shebe Gumsendi Gawasa Gachimbo Yoba Sagi Yoba Dinigi Rigbe Domba Yume Dang Domba Yume Dang Yoba Layang Jidenda Nidenda Sumden Ye Din Ye Lam Gomba Yang Ngama Namle Chima Che Chodu Sache Chewa Song Xing.
Lama Tsongkhapa continues. This reasoning also makes clear that depending on whether one has the support of vows, and if so, whether it is 1, 2, or 3 sets of vows, the cultivation of the path will be the more effective the more one has.
Domdendigi da kewa sabane kewa chewada deni domba mebe kewa domde mayimbaji da kimbaji kewa sabani chebena domdendigi kewa sabade kewa cheware yeze domba yume dangsi disword.
So here the key point is what makes a difference in the merit accumulated is whether one has the support of vows or not.
Da yeba layang jiden da niden sora. Da jiden da niden sededa denege domba yeba delaya no sodagi domba de temba jiti temba da dan sodagi domba da di gang le ya janji simbe domba de temba ina dinyi de kewa tubena sui de kewa chigiri lana dene sodagi domba jibu dembe di domden dige kewa tuba le sodari domba tan janyu simbe domba ni da dembi ge kansa dige ne kansa dige da domden dige an kewa tuba na di kewa de ya shin kewa shin chewa re se su mo re ji den da ni den se de.
And it continues. So the difference in terms of the support comes down to whether one has the support of vows or does not have the support of vows. If one does have the support of vows, what makes a further difference is if whether it is 1, 2, or 3 sets of vows. So this then we can see clearly from the illustration from Sutra above, that if a practitioner
Denige soda domba da janjisibe domba nida demba dele digale nga yi domba dembe domba sumna demba kansa dige nyamne cheba na nyamne di ane niba chewa re seje da ngama namne chima sechu chewa sa shin sine sechu chewa sine sechu niba chewa adu sine sebore sa shin segudu hagodu soda.
Concludes with the cultivation of the path will be the more effective the more one has. So this is just as said, if one has vows, one's accumulation of virtue and therefore progression on the paths will be so much faster than if one does not have vows. And if one does have vows, the sets of vows one is living in accordance with, the number of sets of vows one is living in accordance with will make a great difference to the one speed of spiritual development. So if one has just the vows of individual liberation, so whether ordained or non-ordained, this will make a great difference. But if one also has the vows of the Bodhisattva, then having now two sets of vows, those of individual liberation as well as those of a Bodhisattva, then those same virtuous acts will lead to the accumulation of so much more merit, and thereby enabling an even more rapid spiritual development. And so too, if one has all three sets of vows.
That domdan dembagi kebashe de rabjung domba de dembal siguro dang da raju domba chide de ni de sumdengi di kebadi res da de domba chide de ba ni de de sumden bal kewasa so she kebashe ro de di rabjung domden de siguro je rabjung yin ba la domba chibu sunne jenju sime domba la rabjung yorwa rabjung je ne don rabdu jibe so da domba len jenju sime domba len he yorwa Tene janju rabjung sodagi dombale janju simbe dombale ngagi domanyamle jen rabdu jungwa yorwa di sumgi shi warda dide. Daji nyel siya sumdi domba jide nide sumden siya de rabjung la ya. Didi rabdu jungwa sene kimme ba rabdu jungwa la yo. Rabjung la zo kimba marwa. Rabjung la do kimba mayin bal ko korwa. Chesadi rabjung la do Ejing ato chanju semba rabjung da rabjung mayin ba geshe rawa. Chesada rabdu jungwa de kimbi ge cheba ina dine re. Dan rabjung dige cheba domba yugen dige rabdu jungwa dige cheba diri ya siya dino. Da rabdu jungwa la domba de demba da domba ji de ni de sumden de le keba dine yore siya sungorwa.
So we see there that it's specified that there are up to three sets of vows. The vows of individual liberation of the ordained, those of the Bodhisattva, and those of secret mantra. And the more of these one is living in accordance with, the greater the virtue will come from one's virtuous endeavors because of the power of the support on one's continuum.
Dene kimbal dabosa, kimbal ba chabene, kimbal ayanda, sonam sayala chijung resore. Kimbal dabis, jindong so, jebe, ceyang, nye dan, dabi, domba de dembige, dene, jeba dan, domba mebar jeba, ni, geza, top chechung, shindu chero salos.
So this previous part was the whole paragraph up to this point has really been talking about the difference between the having vows of ordination or not. So perhaps, and the illustration was of an ordained bodhisattva and a non-ordained bodhisattva. Now the next sentence, this brings in to those who are not ordained. For example, there's a great difference in the strength of the roots of virtue according to whether a householder, so someone who's not ordained, at the time of, and I've just changed this, practicing generosity and the like, acts on the basis of keeping vows, such as one-day vows, or whether he acts without any vows.
양지 트림소야 세바 고미알라 소바단 기회 냠난 가르쳐베나 시고로다 데네기 지용도 갑라 네 데네기 양 니네 자비스 니네기 돈발을 내봐 니마지게 니자지게 돈발을 내제 데네기 돈발을 내디긴디기 네 데네기 진배 냠네 제바 개와 주바 대당 다 니네나 데네 가야만 돈바 가야 미딩기 김비기 니디기 개와 제바도 수치기레세나 데네 돈바 가야 미딩베기 가자디기 이킴바디게 깨어짐바 땅와래 이선음 델레 다니네기 돈발에 내신배 가사디기 다 짐바 땅와나 짐바디 선음 채와래 세월.
The Tibetan starts with, as usual, where we are in the middle. So the translator used giving donations, which is fine, but it's the normal term for practicing generosity. And then it says, and the like. So again, this will be mentioned later, and I've mentioned it many times already. Whilst this portion of the text is mainly presented through the lens of generosity, it refers to all virtuous or non-virtuous activities. So if we say generosity, but also patience and so forth, so all virtuous endeavors or non-virtuous endeavors. So one should understand it in this way. So whether a householder, so a non-ordained person, is engaging in an act of generosity, for example, and doing so with or without vows on their continuum, such as one-day vows, the amount of merit accumulated from this act will be vastly different.
대신 소정기 되네기 슈디기 너무 슈디기 되네기 냠래 니리베 내가블라 되네기 짐바당알로 소와케와 체와 디나시 되네기 내기니 돈바데 템바당 야 데레야 아니 김발래야 전주심비 돈발래야 여러와 김바 기니 돈바 템바당 디기 수는 푸알레 기니 돈바다 다 전주심비 돈마니다 템비기 기니 디기다 짐바당알로 소와케와 좀네 디아바 기차와 차기로와 디나시 다 기니 돈바데 템바다 아니 전주심에 돈바데 템바 이게 템베게 강사디게다 기 진배님는 제바디다 야 기니 돈바데 템바 전주심에 돈바데 템바 상하기 돈바데 템바 데니게 돈바 숨데 템베게 강사디게 님는 제비 개워주바나 개워데 니바체와 차고로 와다 지발 요수시와
So we see in the text, acts on the basis of keeping vows, such as one-day vows. So this, of course, is just an illustration, because the non-ordained or householders can have a wide variety of vows on the continuum. Clearly, what is lacking is the vows of the ordained, but there are many types of vows specific for those who are not ordained. So there are one-day vows, there are the 8 Mahayana precepts, there are the lay vows that one takes for life. So there are a variety of vows, and whatever of these one has, this will serve to boost the amount of virtue one accumulates. And likewise, if in addition to those vows, such as one-day vows or the 8 Mahayana precepts or the lay vows, if one also has vows of a bodhisattva, the bodhisattva vows, or perhaps even those of secret mantra, then that too will boost how much virtue one creates from a virtuous action. So from this section, then, we can see the difference that the support on the continuum makes. The support being whether the virtuous act is supported by the presence of vows and the presence of how many vows the practitioner is living in accordance with.
Topchishun yobada, da dombada dembada, dombada midimbi toneda, and Gawa Topchishun yobadi, Sungorwada, Gawalishin Chishun in the Yorese.
So this section makes clear, the sub-outline makes clear, that there's a great difference in terms of support for one's virtuous actions if one is ordained or not ordained. And moreover, it makes clear the great difference if one is living within vows or not.
저 대단 가와메나 가메네 되네 소소야게 되니게 니마 미성화 주부게 되니게 지용체다 나 직 잡아마인바 차송베네 대수기 다 거기라 하는 소제 심제 미수기메 셈베게 켈렌다 안에 제 미절레미 준시메 셈베 켈렌다 되니게 안에 가서 구마구메 셈베게 되니게 켈린 돈바디 예되어레서래 예레스 Travel Shorwa, Mison Church, Travel Shorwa, the Misuyata, Kumakuyata, Michelame, Shimena, Dida Gayo Marwa, Magawanza, Digi Sumiki, Tombachi, Yudere. Sangchoba, Misawa Choba. In Tablo Sarva, Miso Yamarwa, Kumaku Yamar, Michel and Jun Yamarwa, Tomba Shiora, Zawa Shin Yorwa, Sunyarwa, Kilindwa. She's not Misawa Choba did the Casonwa, Dakota Losonwa, Ineko Miso Yamarwa, Michel and Jun Yamarwa, Kumarinda Kumaku Mena, Tene Kumaku Mena, Di Domba Sum Dico Yedere. Disum di Misawa Chubi Dombada, Agasa So Chubi Dombada, and then Michel and Junshi Dombada, and then Kumaku Dombati, Korangu Yuder, the Gamena, then Guyana Yomarwada. Yomar. Chesati Yobanza, Digi Geotuna, Geopatum Bachevas, Kimba Domba Mebale, the Nigo Kongit Geotu, the Geoshin Chevachagore, Chibanda.
If we take as an illustration someone who was ordained and living in accordance with the vows of the ordained, but then they broke their root vow of celibacy. So then there would no longer be an ordained person having broken that root vow of celibacy, but they still will have kept their other primary vows or root vows of the ordained. Whilst ordained, they didn't kill, they didn't steal, and so forth. So therefore, whilst they did accumulate non-virtue from breaking that root vow, they accumulated extensive virtue through living in accordance with the other vows.
Chesandiro, so Chugme, Missugme, Simitomba, Missugme, Simitomba, Sunduna, that Tombata Gayo Marwa, Gayo Mara, Tomba Savi, Tomba Shior, Chesna the Mison Chuba Jun the Court of Lord Wada, Kimban Casset, Chesanditan Mother, Chesada Sochu, Missugme, Sembigeta, some of Sundivana, Misochubi, Missubiget, Son Soju Dombadi, Yudirwa. Tangi Kuma Cook Mays and be some of Yodivana and the Yovarwa. Chesada, Mujel and Junshi Mays and be some of the costume Sudina, Cotomba Sum de Sundigorda. Chesadi Sunduza, Sosugate, D. Sosugi Misan Chobalaso, Dombaton, Havana, Tisun, Jigmes and Sundivana, Yawara. The Niki Sumban, Delia, and the Corotombos, Sum Sundiva Inza, the Kaot of Nekao Chimbosagore, Kawashi Satukore.
So having broken a root vow and therefore no longer being ordained, that person still, if they are to still make the commitment, I will continue to act in accordance with the other root vows. I will not kill, I will not steal, I will not lie. Then they will accumulate extensive virtue because those vows were not broken. And now by committing to continue to live in accordance with the other root vows of not killing, not stealing, and not lying, they will accumulate extensive virtue and thereby continue to be able to have this power behind their virtuous deeds.
Baba Meva Chagordine, that course and then so Chugme said, Michel and Junshi said, Kumoku Messi Sunedi, to Sun Dubana, and Kin to be shin and it Sum Sungor, isn't that? Gavachesa, or just not the name Zangazugi, that Rabjuin that Kin that Chick Dan Carson, down at Beckon Chazan, Mama Sunga, that Sum the Chick the Carson, Ni Sum the Yawasumtina, so Gava Yawasa. Geshe Thubten Rabten Chegore, then Nida Gasona, Nidi Yawasona, the Antigorva, Antig Sumna Gasomana, Missero, Gentile, Sigmes and Pigeta, Sumdena, the Anticavat, Chegor, Benanzi, the Jua, Chigan Mebala, Guma, Yadamba, Yavache, that dinner, you should send a Mevachas on that, do you don't that Chazan Lucian Jimara? Do you don't know you should send a Mevachan, do you don't know Mevale Mayorva? Tang Obsama Mevach and Obsama Mayona, Mevale Yarwa. Then do you don't know Mevachan and you should send a Mevale Yarwa? Deny that.
the same is true for a non-ordained person. So a non-ordained person who has taken the lay vows and made the commitment not to kill, not to steal, not to engage in sexual misconduct, not to lie, not to take intoxicants, and then having a living in accordance with those vows, but then breaks one of them. So let's say that of sexual misconduct. So there, it's important that the person not only recognizes and confesses that they've broken this vow, but also recognizes that others are not broken. They still have the vows not to kill, not to steal, not to lie, not to take intoxicants. Therefore, to recommit themselves to living in accordance with those vows. It's not necessary they must recommit to living in accordance with those vows because they have them, but because they have them whether they recommit or not. But nevertheless, to make clear to themselves, I still have the vow not to kill, and I will continue not to kill. I may have fallen short of the promise I made in terms of not engaging in sexual misconduct, for example, but I have lived up to my promise in terms of the other vows, and I will continue to do so. With such an attitude, being aware that the vows that have not been broken, or being aware that those that have not been broken are unbroken, then this person will continue to live within those restraints. They will not kill, they will not steal, they will not lie, they will not take intoxicants, and therefore they will continue to accumulate great merit, because the other meritorious acts will be powered by those vows of restraint. So this is important to know. And it's perhaps to give an illustration is, let's say you have $100 and you lose some of that money. Perhaps a bet goes wrong or you just lose it. Well, you still have something left. So look after that money. Don't waste it. Don't then throw it all away. So it's similar here, that if one falls short of the promise one has made, it's not the end of the world. One needs to confess and purify those downfalls, but continue to strive to keep those vows that one has not degenerated, that have not been broken.
domade midem bachi da dumbetem ba yige bene semjen roji social cheben diba chebena diba ni suchi dumbatem ba digi diba chene diba chewa chagore na jisen kewa dubene kewa chewa yo banaji diba chebena diba chewa chagore.
Throughout this presentation is towards activities, both virtuous and non-virtuous. So here I've just spoken about virtuous, but it's also the case with non-virtue. If you've made the promise not to kill and then you kill, the virtue is much greater because you have made that promise, I will not kill, and then you end up doing so. So the non-virtue is also amplified by the power of the support of vows on a continuum.
수rim차와 설집에 돌려서 다 수림차와 설집에 돌아나려 가르송으로서네 돌려서 미게 주단 된비 미시기 균도 바시 매버 로기 버도 디바 사바베 결론 수림 라베 장송기 개생기 요네 대비 진발라 샤지 롱제나 미가와 치 마월 송바라 송바양 띵유권에 디바 돕차오스.
So that concludes that sub-outline. Now we come to look at the grave consequences of faulty ethics. So Lama Tsongkhapa starts by quoting from Sutra. The Overcoming Faulty Ethical Disciplines Sutra says that compared to a human being possessing the 10 non-virtues, who for 100 years continuously and uninterruptedly accumulates bad actions, a fully ordained monk who has completely broken his vows of discipline and who for one day, dressed in the victory banner of sages, enjoys that which has been offered in faith to him, accumulates far more bad actions. Again, because of the support, the bad actions have greater strength.
Delia, Donala Carson, Migi Judan Dimba, Mishigi, so that Domna Kimbachis or Domna Midi Domba the Midimbigi, Gansachi, Gansa Michigi, ne Miguel Juda Demba, Lunga Yusumi, Kawachu, Miguel or Jedikan Gansachi, Michigi, Yundu Barmacheba, Gedina, Muduche, and Chige Tipachina, Yundu Barmacheva, Logi Bardu Tipa Sabaina, that Tipa Bemasi Chimoshagorwad, Gazam, Migi Jugi, and Tipa Yabache, Satugu, just a Lunga Yusum you and a Sagorwa, they are them Gunduche, Barmache, Gunduche, and the Logi Bardu Sabaina, that Tipa Shu Sagorwad, the Nigi Tipa Saba, the Tipa Chimburwas.
The sutra starts with, compared to a human being, so this will refer to a non-ordained person possessing the 10 non-virtues. So in other words, someone engaging in the 10 non-virtues, who for 100 years continuously and uninterruptedly accumulates bad actions. So clearly this is someone who over an extensive period of time, 100 years, through their physical acts, their way of speaking, their way of thinking, is continuously engaging in non-virtue. It's very clear an immense amount of non-virtue will be accumulated.
Gelon Tsudim Raiwe, said that Domba Nyamdigan or Tsudim Raiwe, and the Jansongi Jetsin Yone, said that Janson, San Jumden Tiki, Chelu Sinji, Jasha Quantibatsura, the Yone, and the Debe, Jimbalas, Mishanagi, Debache, Ya, Pusheviki, Kalala Sobada, Denegi, Denegi, Kalare, and the Dere, and Dulola Kayungua. Denega me debache appreciate by Denegilia and Shaji launcher by Nimichik, Bene Dengal and Nimichik by Nada, and the Kala and Mason, the Denega Saji Sabain and launcher and Miguelati, Chemason, Deji, Kimbigi, Migo Judah, and Dembigi, Mutija, Lui Geba, the Diva Saba, Diva Dele, Gelon Sutimda, Domba Nyam, the no, and the Chick the no, Yodor Jen, and the Chica Jasha Gwen Duje, and it. Me Pugi Denegi Seji, and Yimichi launch of an Dipati Dichares.
Then the comparison is made. A fully ordained monk who has completely broken his vows of discipline and who for one day, dressed in the victory banner of sages, so dressed in the robes of the Buddha, enjoys that which has been offered in faith to him, accumulates far more bad actions, so accumulates far more non-virtue.
And
the reason is clear. It's because of the strength by way of the support.
And in Lung Namje Les and Lung Namje Nalia, Donala Carson, Duigi, Lung Chungshira Dinalia, Chao Gong Meje Bawa. Da Sever Gua Cho Yinji, Sudim Sulchel Yanda Pigi, Midumbe Esa, Sulche Yanda Midumbe, Yugo Sunim Sawa means she and Sulcher Dang, Sulja Labor Heba, Niga Sunsosa.
Now, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes from the Vinaya. It is better, and I've just changed some of the translation in the third line, and which will continue that change in the first sentence below the verse. It is better that they eat lumps of iron blazing with tongues of fire than for those with faulty ethics or not completely restrained to eat the alms foods of the local people. This has been taught with regard to both faulty ethics and slackness in training.
That in a Jago Meje Barwata, Zeber Gua Choi, Sudim Chaya, Sulchay Yada Midumpi, and Yuko Sunium Sa means, and that Carson was ne Pene, to give Ja 매일 봐봐 자도도 매일 봐지 배 마우 슈차지네 자고 매발 왔다 마바디 디파 세베나 엔 세바네 다 동아 봐도 매번 영화시라 같이 지진 두어 봐도 매번 용구로와 아 얘네게 세바네 동아 네 세버 유아 초인제세 네 세바디 쇠네 디와 봐도 매번 용구로와서 안 딜레 디버체와 가려용으로서네 안에 수심차와 대 수심 얌제 안에 되는 안에 이제 대시 주간에 다시 도시는 되잖아요. 되네. 안에 인도도 진도잖아요. 안에 지금 유고 수념 사와민 세대 되네게 수념 미션하게 대비 부여 수념의 사와이나 안에 디바디 딜레 동안 가서 디바체 연구를 그래서 딜레 딩이데 자고 매바와데 사와 초인시데 디 사와는 사와레 아니 데니게 수림 냠제 안체네 미 데비 푸지 쇠님지 사와는 디게 제보 동안요아데 딜레 초알 체와레스 뱀마스 체보레스 뱀네 자고 매바와 마와치 초선 디산의 리와레스 야가레스 오다 뱀네 자고 매바와치 도도지 칸마 주샤바나 시대 시루를 동아 빠도면 중요한데 내가 지루와 수림 차야지 돈반 냠 되는데 다시하고 돈반 지 유도도 전에 아니 지금만 지게 미 대비 푸유 쇠님이 사와는 디 제부 동아데 녀월마 빠도면 봐 용어 차그래서 난 대시디 자고 매바마세데 초세데 니미지 살지루와 지다다 되네게 제부 동아데 아니 녀월 바지에 동아 빠도면 봐 로마 보냐고다 딜레 신든 체와 체고로 어디선데 던다 디슨 거래.
The meaning is quite clear here. It's a comparison again is being made that if one compares the suffering of eating blazing lumps of iron, so we can think of an ironmonger who's beating a piece of metal, and to do so will have heated it so that it's blazing red. We can imagine if one eats that, the immense pain that one would experience, even if it was something small, so that one could swallow it, the immense pain that one would experience. That is less suffering than would be experienced by those who, than for those with faulty ethics or who are not completely restrained to eat the alms food of the local people. So this is similar to what's been expressed above. That when someone who has broken a root vow is no longer ordained, but still acts before others as if they are, in other words, they are showing the signs, are dressed as an ordained person, and then receives offerings given with faith, they will accumulate so much more non-virtue. That non-virtue will lead to rebirth in the hell realms, where the intensity of the suffering and the duration of the suffering will be far worse than merely the suffering experienced in this one life of eating blazing iron.
네, 어디서는 디바 침보여봐대. 네, 제 차수에다 라발 해봐라. 니가라 송세 주는 야보 마송하다. 안 주는 냠바 니가라 야도신 지바레스 월다. 디바 제여야 돼.
So therefore, the next sentence, this has been taught with regard to both faulty ethics and slackness in training.
아니냐, 덴비 송네 시대인다 지시 덴바와 지시 송네. 지송네 아니 철라 덴비 디바 디비스 감나 미가와 주 디바 주주 인송대 마와 나오서.
And Lama Tsongkhapa continues, and I've just changed 2 words. Drontompa's statement that the non-virtue of engaging in the 10 non-virtues is very small when compared to the non-virtue of having broken one's reliance on the Dharma appears to be true.
나 철라 딘비 디바세 지단 철라 딘비 디바세 난 고야라 철라 딘발라는 안 주게 야 안에 지게 유리야 되는 ben에 산요권 쇼권저 기둥고 철이야 된비 디바사야 돼 철에 된비 디바사야다 아니 최게 아니 가서래 맞지 Benny Chelia and Lobama Soba de Chebene, and the Chele Timbe, Lobarmawa. Loba said, Yo Mare, Gigi said, Lobama, Chelia, and then to Che de Kepa, Bechi Pa, Denigi, Gambu Doze, Dia, the Chebene, Chele Timbe Tipa says, You go in the Quajore. That the Cap di Chele Timbe Tipa said, This Sungo Mare, Chopongile del Sungo Mare. Cap di Chele Timbe Tipa said, Domata Tembi Kansati Sole. Denigi Tomba Yaboma Sungi, Denigi Kansatom, Denigi Tom Dendiga, Tomba Dini, Chebane, then the Diva Cherry said this one, Chola Timbe Diva said, the Jigan share the Jibade Donda, Chola Timbe Diva, and Dibi Gamna said, Churum Denigi Tomba, Kaling and Diba Cheba Gi, Di Tiba Chunchi, Di Damla, Gamna, Di Damla, and Migi Jubong, Migi Diba Ju in Song said, Domba Masunking, Kimbachi, Migi Jubung, Diba Jebadi, Chunchu Res or Juju say Chunchu. Jeza, Chela Timbi, Domba the Timbi, Kansachi, Diba Jeba Dele, Migi Jubongi, Sudim, that Migi Judan, Dembi, Kimbachi, Diba Jebadi, that is you look about Diba Chassi, Diba di Denigi Rabjungi, Sudan Dembachi, Diba Jeba Dele, Diba Chunchu Res, when you do one, Diba Chunchu Res, Juju said Chunchu Goda Chuchu. Chunchu Res or Chela Timbe Diba said Chidang, Chela Timbe Diba said Chidang, and they got so and Anzuki Chela Din, Diba Yashur, Chela Timbe Diba Sur, Chobongi Leva Jebana, Che Mare, Che the Tigo Masikun Jebana, the Chela Timbe Diba Chayurwa. Dene Koya or Chola Timbe Diba said, the Koyas, that the captain Chola Timbe Diba said, Dene Koya Mares, Chola Tin said, Tomba Sunkangi Kansa, Yamlinchi and the Kansa, the Diba Chunju Jebale, and then Tomba the Midembiki, Kansachi, Migo Jubong, Sudim, Casa Migi Ju, Diba Jebaina, Diba the Chunju Res. Ding Turbaina.
It's reading it again. John Tomba's statement that the non-virtue of engaging in the 10 non-virtues is very small when compared to the non-virtue of having broken one's reliance on the Dharma appears to be true. So usually what would be meant by a reliance on the Dharma would be referred to engaging in non-virtue against the objects of refuge, against the three jewels, or about propounding wrong views which are contrary to the Dharma. So that would usually be what is meant by breaking one's reliance on the Dharma. But that isn't the meaning here. The meaning is as states, is not living in accordance with the vows one has taken. So not living the non-virtue, what would in other contexts be a minor non-virtuous act, but because that minor non-virtuous act leads to the breaking of a vow, it is then a greatly non-virtuous act. And that greatly non-virtuous act is even worse than breaking the 10 non-virtues for 100 years continuously. In other words, engaging in non-virtue with one's body, speech, and mind continuously for 100 years. That is less non-virtuous, or not as non-virtuous, as breaking one's vows. And again, when this reference is that what would be otherwise a minor non-virtue, but because that minor non-virtue is contrary to the vows one's taken, that non-virtue is immense.
So the Kazang to Shin Latin, Tipa Shishun Geshe Shin Latin, Jida Shin Dilla, San Yu Concho, Chu Concho, Kitun Concho said, Jida San Ye Latin be Tipa Saya, and Che Latin be Tipa Saya, and then Genu Latin be Tipa Saya, Jida the Negi, Che Latin be Tipa Sayadi, Go Shin Latin be Tipa La Goyaji or Wada, G. Goyer. That did the Che Latin be Tipa Sayadi, Che Latin Basin, Dombasun de Hengi, Gansatis, Digi. Diva Saba Dele or Diva Saba Dele, Doma Misungi, Kimbi, Mu Jubongi, Diva Jebadi, Diva de Chunchun as Sungora.
So again, just to clarify this reliance on the Dharma, so this would Normally we could refer to such things as what we looked at last night, which is the great strength by way of the field. And there we saw one of the great strength by way of the field refers to the 3 jewels. So if one were to engage in non-virtue in relation to the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, then that would be greatly non-virtuous. So that's what we looked at last night. And this would not be a common understanding of reliance on the Dharma. But here it refers to the vows on one's continuum. So in this context, this expression, reliance on the Dharma, refers to the vows on one's continuum.
Dansa yu chikpa, chimba tangye ze chikpa, anu kunlong chikpa ro shime na ya, ta ten domden di imbi chane, gewa ina, gewa padumi ba, gewa chewa saya da, domden imbi chane, ande to kasore, gewa chechung dus keba yu bare. Di na shi, diwa saba ina ya, diwa chege da, chikpa ro chi, pene medo ro chi, shengi, yan chala chi, chola tangba ina, chikpa ina ya, that domden tingi chane domden digi diba chebadi diba shindo chawa and domden member chigi diba chebadi domdale den diba chungwa res kuni da dusin chechung yeba mi shenda chi medo shine medo ko shana 결혼이 medo yorwa nge ko shana dibarwa 결혼이 매바 잘라던 거로와 마음에 결혼 domden digi medo ko 매바 쇠바다 domden member digi 매바 쇠나 domden digi 매바 diba cheja 그래서 Pene 결혼에 잘라 직 결혼에 잘라 모바일 펀디 domden member 지게 꾸마 개와당 domden 지게 꾸마 제베나 domden 지게 꾸마 제베디 디바 셰세 꾸마 개 잘라 직바 지세 유 직바 아니 꿀롱 꾸마 예 직바 이나양 그래서 띵이 차네다 디바 셰사레세 그래서 디나지다 메도 세지 미션다지 메도 야고 답세냐에나다 콜 마가웨 토네 메도데 고 촐라 다샤베나 고샤베나 다 데니기 군노데레 메도기 데니기 domden지기 제바다 domden 멤버 제바디기 다 고세 메도 지직바 아니 군노아 직바 두시레데 이나 띵기 전에 dom바데 여다 메베전에 디바 체주 차기를 해야 돼 두시네 당가서 개와이나 개와 체주 여바 아니 디바이나 디바 체주 여바 디가 센때 domden기 전에 해야 돼.
So in brief, the meaning of great strength by way of the support, where support refers to on the continuum, one's virtuous or non-virtuous actions have the support of vows abiding on the continuum. The virtue or non-virtue engaged in is greatly enhanced by the presence of vows on the continuum. And this is to be understood. The illustrations are those of generosity, but it should be understood for any virtuous or non-virtuous activity. It is greatly enhanced by the presence of vows. And the illustration given from this Heap Jewels Sutra was where where offerings are made, and the difference primarily comes down to the difference in terms of whether vows are present or not. The motivation could be the same, the recipients could be the same, but if the vows are present, so much more merit will be accumulated, even if there is great difference in terms of what is offered. So again, the motivation is the same, the recipient is the same, but what is offered is much less. But even if something much smaller is being offered by someone holding vows, so much more merit is created. But this is also the case for non-virtue, for not acting in accordance with one's vows. And here, if someone with vows not to steal, as opposed to someone without vows not to steal, steals the same thing with a similar motivation, and they're stealing the same object, the person with vows not to steal will accumulate so much more non-virtue. So therefore, from these illustrations, we understand that both one's virtue or non-virtue is greatly enhanced by the presence of vows.
sunguye sibeda dushine ane samda da di thone ata gewa chubaine gewa de phen chimbu yobade hago waje dine an susarangi da di thone gewe jawa 강도 zemje 탐제 ane jige 샤라 뇌비게 자와 지금의 셈비게 되는 삼노다에 토네 안 되는 게 순구에 domba 순구에 셈비게 당아 dom대이 재상이 dom바단 개위게 되는 게 dom된 지가 아주 제야데 개위 주야 돼 가지고 내가래 셈베 삼도네 가지고 개와 같이 주었는데 팬치부 요바자 하고 와자 니도네 가지고 냠면 강도도 개주 강도도 주부래 순거로 와다 도나 닝보데
The impact this presentation should have on us is that we should come to identify as a holder of the vows of the Buddha. So whatever vows one has, one should identify as, I am a holder of the vows of the Buddha. Therefore, I will live within the restraints of those vows. Because these vows are what will keep, by living in accordance with these vows, I'll live in accordance with the restraints of what is ethical. And I will not go beyond the restraints of what is ethical. In other words, I will not be unethical in my way of acting and speaking, and ideally in my way of thinking. So this is the outcome to come to identify yourself as being a holder of the vows of the Buddha, and therefore I will live as well as I can within the restraints of these vows. And in this way, I will fulfill the promises that I have made. So it's about the vows one has, keeping them well, living well within those restraints. And one can also give rise, having heard of the great benefits of living within the vows, give rise to the aspiration to live within vows if one is not yet so.
아니 내게다 내게 저기 당보 rab중 임바제 되네 한 저기 미상화 줘발라서 비게 안에 저기 되네게 중원지에 안에 저기 rab중 마임바 차송바 있네요 나되네 소스라랑기 나 소주베 dom바다 안에 구마고야 고야 재미하다 된딩이 아니 저기 미셸레미 준시에기 dom바숨디 담마가와 여바이나 어디네 소스라랑 어디딩이 지게 메상주비게 dom바도 송토요 말때 이내 dom바 현다 숨딩에 송디야 선비게 디야후이 되는 상이게 마 제수주에게 되는 소수 dom바도 송구였으면 된 모든 송기 선비게 삼로 토하나 되는게 소소 디 송에 디 가와 공부 토하네 당이 저 게죠 되는 주가 있나 당한직 대한 개와 현다 dom바 송은 강사체나 샤라게 개와 체 사고로 되네 돈에 먼저게 나는 that 제사 먼저 삼로들 오다니 되니기 도 숨지데 가데 되나 숨되는 수에데 제사디 야후 숨기야 선배게 두 삼다제 디토능이 난 계주 주변 선배 삼다 계주 주변이나 나게 어디 슈치모 사요 바디 디나 도나마 숨바디 고고로 받아.
And furthermore, it was said earlier that those who have the vows of the ordained, but then break one of the root vows, such as, for example, that of celibacy, in such an instance, do not give up on ethics, but rather both recognize the fault of having broken one of the root vows that one promised to uphold, but also recognize, I still have those other vows, and recognizing this, remind yourself of the great benefit of living in accordance with the vows that one has taken. In other words, living within accordance with the ethical restraints that one has promised to uphold. That vow still, or those vows still exist on your continuum. So recommit yourself. I will not kill. I will not steal. I will not engage in lying. And thereby, one will still continue to accumulate extensive virtue. So this process involves an honest recognition, or looking at oneself honestly. And this will have a negative aspect, but don't dwell on that negative aspect, but come to see yourself in a balanced way, and thereby commit to living in accordance with the vows that one still has.
아디나시나 저기 기니 도바레 데니자 추지게 되네 년에게 도 말아서 받데 렌데베나 네여바나 또 소식이 아다 돈바데 데네 렌저베 야후인 선배 가와 코미하다 디 토네 하는 네 돈바데 탈친제 직 dona yin peke gewa druba ina yang gewa de shukche sa da chimbo sa da domdan yin zang gewa sa ba ne gewa shukche sa gyo na and de ji do che wa de ang ji da how nyam na je wa de ke chimbo sa gyo wa.
And the same is true for the vows of the non-ordained, if those are broken. But also, what I encourage you also to do is to recognize the vows that you have taken and rejoice in this. Rejoice in that excellent decision that led you to take these vows. And then, through this rejoicing, commit again and again to living in accordance with them. Because this committing to live in accordance with the vows helps to keep them fresh, alive within oneself, and thereby it becomes ever easier to ethically live within those confines.
주름 송세야디 안주에 삼다이도 지상 소소게다 lunga yusum yukone shenla nyoba zao yin chigime chizada denegi tarbata tamji kimbe goba tobe chedonge lunga yusum shenla nyoba zao yin chigime surim sungi sanbege denegi tone samna taje surim sungi tone gewa dubana yandiyan gewa betok chimbu chagurwa surim mason wada kanya sam madaba chige gewa dubale da surim sungi tone gewa dubadi gewa di shukche saguro chisa dine zang zoge gewaru chu gari chebe na dinyelya ta dinge lunga yusumyo kone shala nebe zawagine chigime dibe jawasa zawagine chigime samje andi den zada ne tarpata tamje kimbe gowa toya donala ne gewa tubi sembe gejo chebeina ta surim sunwe tone azu gejo chebenza ne gewa de dopche chagoro.
And for those who have not yet taken vows, that is not an impediment to living ethically. So there one can still develop the determined attitude, I will live ethically. I will restrain my physical behavior, my speech, and as best I can, my mind too. Restrain it within the confines of what's ethical. So it's not necessary to receive vows in order to live ethically. Going through the ceremony to receive vows, making that promise in the ceremony, this is incredibly helpful to living thereafter within the vows, but it's not indispensable. So even for those who have not taken vows, make the firm commitment, I will not cause harm. Certainly not through my physical behavior and not through my speech, and my mind, I will try to restrain it too. And every time you think like this, as you are right now, and in times going forward from now, every time you think like this, you generate merit. Every time you recognize the great benefit of the vows you have taken, and you strengthen your commitment to live in accordance with them, as well as perhaps give aspiration to take further vows, great merit is accumulated. Especially, or to enhance this, do so within the context of the results of ethics, reminding yourself, because of these promises I've made to live within the confines of what is ethical, I am creating the causes that will lead to further excellent rebirth. And moreover, because I've taken these vows and I try to live my life with the goal of accumulating the causes that will lead to Buddhahood, by living within the context of these vows, I'm continuously accumulating causes that will lead to my enlightenment for the sake of others, my complete liberation from suffering, so that I can guide others to achieve such a state. So by reminding oneself of the vows one has taken and the great benefits thereof, one accumulates extensive virtue and strengthens the restraints of ethics that one lives in accordance with.
나는 개와 치션이 숨도와 의배체네 이네 샘제라 진보동화라 주기 진바당 상기 최바라 최바로 드비 최바 니 산승기 진바당 최발레 체풀로 중화데 디춘에 현야 셰바자오스.
Now to the third of the four, great strength by way of the thing, so the thing or the object. In the case of giving gifts to sentient beings, giving the Dharma is supreme. And in the case of making offerings to the Buddhas, offering one's practice is supreme. Each being far superior to gifts and offerings of material things. Using this as an example, and understand it to apply in other cases.
Jamro labia, jamro chechuya, jamro labs, jamre chechuya, janju sim, jam nije pa labse to comchuya, then in the chukijimba chagurova chukijimba. Then jamro said, then to say what is it, jamro lap call comchuya, janju jam nije, then the decomgor said, Mijung comchuya, Lucian, janju sim comchuya, pa labse comchuya, the chukijimba. Go mashing by chuki lobsang by de, call pa com, jinyam the chichin the chukijimba. Says I dinigim. Chugi Chimba, Denigi, Mapa, Kolia, Chimba, Kolia, Kalada, Dulore, Jebene, Gawar Sago, Pendorugo, Pembi, Semjukunia, Jebene, Dele Pen Sagore, Sagor, the Dile, Pen Chawadi, Kolia, Mashing by the Shevachi, Lapche, and Jambraja, Gawar Thubten, Chimbe, Yamnaja, Surin Yamnaja, Sube Yamnaja, Jamni, Sanjula, Comegi, Yamnaja, Rimba, Lapche, Koke, Palava, and the Chigi Chimba, or those Yamnaja, Chigi Chimbare, Nikewadi, Gawachava as well.
Look in the first line. In the case of giving gifts to sentient beings, giving the Dharma is supreme. So giving the Dharma is the supreme gift to give to others. Giving material objects, whatever they may be, none equal the value of giving the Dharma. Giving the Dharma would refer to guiding others how to live ethically, understanding what are the causes of happiness and what are the causes of suffering, and guiding others in how to adopt or cultivate the minds that are ethical and therefore the causes of happiness, and how to abandon the minds which are non-virtuous, the afflictions, and therefore the causes of suffering. Guiding beings like that is so much more beneficial than giving anything material. Likewise, in teaching others that liberation from suffering in its entirety is possible. And this is how you can get there. So guiding them how to gain freedom from suffering is of far greater value than material generosity. Likewise, independence on that training them how to generate bodhicitta, to recognize that others are suffering too, that they are in pain for the same reasons that you are, and they, like you, yearn to be freed from suffering. So teaching them about bodhicitta is of far greater benefit than giving anything materially. And so too in the practices that beings need to engage in order to achieve excellent rebirths or liberation or Buddhahood, training such as generosity, as ethics, as patience, enthusiastic perseverance, concentration, wisdom, teaching others how to train their minds, cultivate these within their minds. This too is of far greater benefit than material generosity.
Andadi pain chewa imbi gimtendi da pachule jimbare kalaro jine ko gangare seje and pendo chiorde and ganga sema dile laba senda kayo marwa da wolya ane jige 주름 소야기 송고래 세다 되네기 안 짐베다 냠네 제월 팔라바이나 코디 냠네 제바나 니 소소 코론리아 개와사 개와디기에 세대다 개와 치마레이네 디규야게 규지 유튜브에 봐서 안디기 진 디천다 고 뭐버디기 콜 판도 셰셰거로 와 세대라다 제 치마 디기 두야게 벤 주름 송고래 세베소나 콜랍지 주름 소다 링아스 니지 주름 소다시 콜바 랍네 고 냠네 제주바이나 안 세대레이나 코론리아 개와 사야데 디기야디 안 개와 치마이나 원료 고방토비 규샤야다 탈바다 탈비 탐지kimbe 고방토야게 사본 딘 마소나 어디 사규요 바인자 다디 개와 체 바도메 개와 신도네 체와 체거로 와다
So this is important to understand well, to understand clearly, because it was presented here is not to deprecate the material generosity or the giving of gifts. It's not to deprecate that and say, don't bother, it's insignificant compared to giving the Dharma. Whilst it is insignificant when compared to giving the Dharma, sentient beings also need to be aided, to be helped from their current predicament. So in particular, when you think of beings in pain right now, if one can alleviate that pain right now, do so. And if that means giving some guidance, giving some friendship, aiding them materially, do so. So do not abandon the one only with the aspiration to give the other. This would be a misunderstanding. So where you can help alleviate the sufferings of beings now, do so in any way in accordance with your capacity. But when doing so, do so with a motivation of understanding that you are helping the being with alleviate their present suffering, but that it is possible to gain complete liberation of suffering. So do so, therefore, with the aspiration, whilst I'm helping this being now overcome their immediate suffering, may I become, through this merit, sufficiently skilled to help beings gain complete freedom from suffering entirely. And through this connection I'm creating with this being that I'm helping now, may I be able to lead them later to complete freedom from suffering. So whilst one is engaging in merely offering of material support, one is doing so with a far greater motivation. This then is a really skillful way to help beings.
Anda sanje le ya cheba phuye je phuye le sanje yi song she be ge nang ju ya lam de je lam de nyam le cheba na de ju be cheba sanje song she be chu nyam le ni ba song she ba ga nyam le cheba na di ju be cheba je da sanje le je la so phuye le phuye yu sunam le su pa to me ba sa go de de le sunam cheba di da sanje song be ge lam nyam le ri ba tyen ba ting ga ju nyam le cheba ina ani di ba ka sa ge wa shin de cheba de sa song do.
And likewise, in terms of offering to the Buddhas, offering something material, whilst excellent to do, is insignificant when compared to offering one's practice. In other words, accomplishing the Dharma in accordance with what the Buddha has taught, accomplishing the Dharma in one's mind in accordance with what the Buddha has taught. Our time for this morning is up, so we'll conclude there and continue this afternoon. Thank you.